Hey, what's going on, Archons? Welcome to another Key Thoughts, my musings on the game of KeyForge. And this week, my thoughts have actually been on Ekwidon. And particularly because of the fact that when I did my pre-release, I opened 3 decks, and each of the decks happened to have Ekwidon in it. So I wanted to kind of talk about that today. So it's these 3 decks right here. Cambiahat, the Ears of Hope, Mother Y Napplethumb, and ZY Yamzania of the Mordant Corridor. That is quite the name. As you can see from these 3 decks here, it was kind of an interesting open because there were basically the same decks in terms of houses. Ekwidon, Sanctum, and then 2 Dinos, 1 Brobs. So I wanted to go into the 3 of these, particularly from the standpoint of Ekwidon, because I noticed something that was really interesting, and I'm starting to get to have played Ekwidon a few times, or at least opened decks and seen what Ekwidon is providing now, and it's really interesting. The feeling that Ekwidon has when I play them is, I don't know how to describe it. It's not quite, I wouldn't say they feel like a main house, although I have had some that come across the way, but they have this really, like they found the good balance of, it feels like Shadows and Logos together. Like that's why I describe it, but definitely it feels more like a Shadows house in a way. It really, I find that really interesting. The reason being, obviously they're stealing here, but I noticed that when I go into Ekwidon, it's similarly how I went into Shadows in previous sets. I would say barring Dark Tidings, because Dark Tidings is my favorite set of Shadows. But here they have just a really interesting aspect to them. And so obviously Market Crash is like here just this card I've never seen before, which is really cool. Swap an artifact from your discard pile with a card in your hand. That's pretty interesting. I actually really liked this card, although this pod was not particularly exciting. I'm not sure I would use it in a alliance context. I definitely don't know if this deck is good, period. But it does have some interesting things. But let's get into some of the cards here. So the thing that I found interesting was something like this: Ornate Talking Tray. So destroy Ornate Talking Tray, make a token creature. I like this because you can get rid of it, and then I could have paired it with Scrounger, and then you just get it back and play it, and you're kind of using, it's like cycling in a way. So I really like it in that sense. But Flea Market I got in 2 of my pods, and this is kind of the thing that made me start going, wow, I'd never seen this before. It's obviously a rare, but I mean, in 3 decks I had, there was 2 of them, so cool rare. It has action: look at a random card in your opponent's hand. You may give your opponent 1 Ember. If you do, play that card as if it was yours. That's an artifact, so every time you're calling Ekwidon, you can do this, which is incredible. You can really disrupt your opponent. The threat of you being able to suddenly do this is kind of wild. Obviously you don't have full agency over what you're looking at. You at least have the ability to cause that disruption and potentially grab something. So it's a pretty neat card. The rest of this, like I said, not super exciting, so I'm going to go over to the next one. But that card really stood out to me as something that is embodying Ekwidon. Now, this deck was the deck that ended up making most of my, was it this one? No, it wasn't. No, it was, yeah. No, not this one. This one though I really like. So I almost made a deck around this Ekwidon pod. So this had, again, Flea Market, but then it had this card here, which I thought was really interesting, and it's called Tourist Trap. So make a token creature, and this choose a friendly token creature and an enemy creature. If you do, swap control of those creatures. So I love this because I thought instantly I mean, there's N4 capture in this deck, so I think this deck is gonna see some testing on my part. I'm excited to test it out. But I saw the potential where you could just throw a bunch of Ember on a creature, and then take it to the other side, and then basically afterwards be in a position where you can just get a whole bunch of Ember back that you exalted or captured onto a creature. Cleric token definitely came to mind with this, and I did have Cleric token in my pool, and I almost, like, I did in fact create a deck around this concept, but I realized that what I ended up ultimately going with was going to be more consistent, and this had pieces that I needed to have in play before it worked. With the other deck, you just did the things and it worked. So I think this is really interesting. I also love that they have dinos as the card art, because most likely exalted dinos, things like that, are what you're going to be using in this swapping thing potentially. I mean, tokens and stuff like that. It says token, but I just thought the dinos were interesting because, you know, dinos exalt and whatnot. So if you had a, like, Trooper, for example, I think you could put in a lot of work and get Trooper so it's almost dead and done some things, and then over to the other side. So I really like Tourist Trap. This also had the Ekwidon Outpost, which hard to argue if this is not the best outpost. I think there's definitely the Sanctum one providing Ember control is obviously very crucial, and then you have the Ganymede Outpost, which is, honestly, I love that just because it's part of the book. But getting to archive cards, 2 cards, something that doesn't really exist in this set, is huge. But I mean, just straight up drawing 3 cards is enormous. Very, very strong. So that part is like, you're getting this Logos vibe in here now. And then again, Flea Market is here. And then this card here as well. Shizoku Swapper. Swap control of this creature and the creature it fights. Both creatures must survive. Again, throwing Ember on this and then fighting into essentially a 5-powered creature or 4-powered creature, anything like that. Quite interesting. Quite interesting indeed. So I really like this. So I was thinking about this idea of loading up Ember on creatures and then boop, putting them across the board. I mean, obviously your opponent could do the same thing, but I think you have the advantage of destroying, like, getting 5 damage and then being able to ping the last 2 or something along those lines. Really interesting. So I was really thinking about that aspect of it when I was playing, and I thought this is really interesting. Then Forced Retirement. Destroy a creature if you do its controller gains 1. Yeah, this is just the Ekwidon thing. It's the trade-off. I don't know. It feels really interesting to play. There's a lot of nuance in the decision making. It's not so straightforward like we've seen in the past, but it does have this feeling of logos and shadows, and I'm really liking that. I think it's just a very interesting thing. I'm always excited to see Ekwidon and see what could possibly be there. Double Ornate Talking Train here, and then Old Tinker. But the main things about this was this Tourist Trap, Flea Market, and then Shizoku Swapper. All these things I thought were I'm like, this is a really interesting archetype that you could build around. Consistency, that may be the problem with it though. So I'm definitely looking to see how this goes. Just for this, the token is Diplomat, so kind of a good thing to swap. It's only 1 power, so you could do some fun things there. Now, just going into the last deck. This is the one I ultimately went with, and aside from having an Infomancer in here, this had Corner the Market, which was a card when I first, like, it's a great card, but I also was curious about the times you play this. I think it's interesting because Ekwidon also has a level of disruption within it, but not the way you normally think of disruption, but there's no question that it's disrupting things. Like, you can't play cards, you can use cards obviously, and then they can archive cards instead. So you're essentially saying that if you have cards you need to play to stop me from forging, you can't do that. It's an incredible way of closing out a game. I really think this card is very interesting. Trade Secrets. This one is very interesting because you're in a position where you can take dead cards, which I'm going to be honest, mass buyout in the deck I made didn't exactly work at times. It was not always useful because I was exalting. I put that Amphora Capturopod in here. So being able to just discard these and steal Ember was really huge. So I think Auction Off is an interesting card. Trade Secrets is an interesting card as it provides that. Again, it's like that Shadows feeling, but then you're getting the Logos vibe as well because of the fact that well, I guess not really Logos is the right word, but you're still removing cards from your hand with value. So anything you don't really need, it's kind of like Autoencoder in a way, because Autoencoder made you think, if I discard this card, getting to archive the top card of my deck, it's that exchange of value for something else. So I do like it like that. Belligerent Guard, such an interesting card. I do like this card. Actually, I don't think I ever not play it. I'm cool with giving my... I think I've one time done, like, my first turn, I let my opponent have 2 cards just to get things moving, and it didn't really affect me that hard. I think it was Belligerent Guard and Closed Door Negotiation, actually, because they went first. Forced Retirement again's here, higher on. This is an interesting one. And then Mass Buyout. Yeah, I actually really like this card. But again, you're giving your opponent something in exchange, but you're also in a position where you're in control of things. It's interesting. It's such interesting decision making. I think this is maybe the best enhancement card in the set. A draw pip and 2 Ember pips is amazing. Like I love that. The 2 power creature. The creature is nothing special at all, but I actually really like seeing Steward Sue Uziani. And of course the Old Tinker. So an Old Tinker, again, discard a card from your hand, draw a card. Classic. That is a Logos classic move right there. So after I saw these 3, I realized that they all provided interesting things, but as you can see here, this whole house only has 4 creatures, and the rest is just actions. So it's a very action heavy is what I want in my Ekwidon. I want to just go into it, do some things, and come back out. I really like that aspect of it. I think it's quite interesting. I do think the creatures do not have incredible value, which is kind of like Shadows. They more had value in... They had the value, but there was always like a setup, and they were maybe a threat, and you had to come back to them, but they weren't always maybe the most appealing choice right off the top. So I just like the decision making with Ekwidon. I think it makes for interesting gameplay and interesting KeyForge turn-based decisions, because when you're gonna call Ekwidon, like sometimes you just hold off, do you wait? Like it's really interesting. So I'm a really big fan of the way Ekwidon plays and what it does. So I hope you enjoyed my rant and ramblings of House Ekwidon after my experience this past weekend. But I have to say, yeah, I think Ekwidon creatures are a little bit lower on the value scale, but I think their actions are top tier, and it creates the most interesting decision. And the reason why this is important is because I think when you have more interesting decisions to make within the game, it makes the overall game more interesting and provides thought and strategy to be contemplated, and you can go left or right type of thing, and what is the cause and the butterfly effect, you can say, of making those decisions. So I really like that Ekwidon provides that at a higher level with more intricacies, more nuances that you have to decide, and what is the true impact of you making those decisions. So hope you enjoyed this, and as always, may your Ember never be stolen and your keys forged promptly. Have a good one.